Very good. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, everyone, for coming in so quickly. We have half an hour, and one of the great joys of this conference is the ability to sort of dive into individual countries in a little bit more detail. India and Indonesia, some fascinating interplay between their two recent histories, new governments, new ambitions, new places in the world. So I'm going to start by asking both Dewi and Garima to just catch everybody up on the foreign policy priorities of the two new governments. One in the third term of Narendra Modi that should be familiar, but in a new international context. One in Prabowo, which is entirely new and in many ways marks a much more radical shift in Indonesian foreign policy than perhaps people outside have noted. So why don't you start? Just sort of give the broad contours of Mr. Prabowo wakes up in the morning. What is he trying to do in the world?
Well, Prabowo sees himself very much as a foreign policy president. He models himself on President Sukarno, as a leader and very activist. But in terms of radical change, for Indonesia's foreign policy, it is not possible because Indonesia has this doctrine of free and active foreign policy. So he can't suddenly just wake up in the morning and say, oh, I like to sign a military alliance with the United States. He'll be thrown out of government. So, but short of that, he has stated very clearly that he wants to continue Indonesia's free and active foreign policy principle in a very robust way. And we need to contrast this. President Joko Widodo was not that interested in foreign policy. He was very transactional, very focused on economic diplomacy. Now, Prabowo is very much a cosmopolitan man. He has lived overseas, including in Switzerland. He has a military background. Recently, he's Minister of Defense. So he's very much interested in the geopolitics, geostrategic issues, which President Joko Widodo was not interested in. At the same time, he's also a businessman, and he looks very much at the juxtaposition between political stability, regional security, and stability with Indonesia's own economic development. So he looks at foreign policy, firstly, as a way to what extent that foreign policy can help Indonesia's own economic development. And at the same time, he also looks at what Indonesia can play in terms of regional politics and also global politics. He sees very much his legacy as Indonesia's activist foreign policy. Indonesia hosted the 1955 Bandung Conference, the first Asian and African conference that brought together all the new emerging countries. And next year, Indonesia, will be celebrating 70th year. So he will try, to make that mark. And as you know, I was quite surprised and shocked that while Indonesia under Joko Widodo was supportive of BRICS, in fact, President Joko Widodo attended the BRICS summit in South Africa, and everybody expected Indonesia to be joining them when it opened up. Joko Widodo said, thanks, but no thanks. But the first thing that the President Prabowo did was when his foreign minister attended the BRICS summit in Kazan, and Indonesia is applying for BRICS. And people say, is this a shift? And they say, it's no, because Indonesia is also applying for OECD. And this he sees as more striking a balance, Indonesia is not favoring one side or the other, but trying to engage all sides.
There we go. For this audience, the Swiss influence on emerging Asian leaders. So we have Prabowo, Kim Jong-un went to school in Switzerland. I'm sure I don't know, not Mr. Modi, but there we are. This is something that Switzerland can be proud of. Garima, in a sense, this is more continuity than change for a third-term Modi administration. But again, how would you characterize Modi's third-term foreign policy ambitions for this audience?
The most important thing for Mr. Modi is to maintain a relationship with the most important strategic partner India has today, the United States. A lot of thought will be put into how to deal with the Trump administration, but also what the Trump administration means for the Indo-Pacific. Would he ramp up the rhetoric on, competition with China? Could it lead to more serious consequences, which nobody in the Indo-Pacific wants, including India? How would the trade wars and tariffs look at? For India, it's also very important. The H-1B visas for skilled Indian workers, Trump in his first term had put a crackdown on that. So that would also be an issue to be managed in this relationship. Second, India would continue working with middle powers in the Indo-Pacific Australia, Japan, a very important relationship, Indonesia, an important relationship as well. And then thirdly, India's role in the global south, which really came to fore during its G20 presidency when it admitted the African Union as a member of G20. I think India would continue focusing on that as well. And there's an element of competition with China there. And what you mentioned, Devi, about the BRICS, I fully agree that often here in the West, people see the BRICS plus expansion as emerging as an anti-Western platform. And I would caution against that because a lot of the members of the BRICS have very close relationships with the West. India, Indonesia applying for OECD, for example. And not everybody is ready to join a sort of China-led bloc or institution. India, for example, plays a balancing role in BRICS, often brings in Western points of view. This was often also clear in G20. So I think we have to be a bit more nuanced when we look at BRICS plus.
We'll get on to BRICS in a minute. So let's do, in a sense, the US-China on both sides. So Modi has already had a phone call with Mr. Trump and described him as my friend on Twitter. Mr. Prabowo has not, I don't think, but I'm sure we'll do.
He has already called.
Oh, he's called already? Okay, very good.
He has already released
Excellent.
the press release.
Very good. Let's start with India and China did a deal just before the BRICS summit. There was I think some nervousness about this in the West, as in whenever India begins to talk to China or Russia, Westerners think, well, this is India at it again. We thought they were our friends, but really they're not. They're just playing the field. How should we read this sort of mini India-China rapprochement? Sort of how serious is it, and what consequences follow from it?
I think it's too much to call it a rapprochement.
I said mini rapprochement.
Even mini is a big word. We've talked about, I mean, the negotiations have been on restoring patrolling rights on 2 points in the border, Tepsang and Damchuk. It's a very long border that India shares with China. And the original problems around the border, which India saw China constructing border infrastructure from 2012 onwards, that has not gone away. It is still a very heavy sort of troop presence from both sides of the border. So it's a good sign because India was adamant on its stand that it will not normalize the India-China relationship till the border issue is solved, but the border issue is not solved. We've seen a move in a positive direction, and hopefully this would lead to disengagement on other points, the question of Arunachal, which is also contested. I mean, this goes a long way. Borders in post-colonial South Asia have been contested, and there's also a sense of, there needs to be work to build trust, I think, on both sides. So it's a move in a good direction because such heavy militarized border of two nuclear-powered countries is not in anybody's interest. But that does not solve the core basis of India-China misalignment.
I was messaging last night with Raja Mohan, former Asia Society India head and also keynote speaker at this conference a few years ago, just to sort of ask him what he thought, as in, did this deal with China open up the space for more cooperation, more balancing, to use the term that was used in the earlier session? And he said, actually, probably not, because doing anything with China is just incredibly hard work. And as you said, all of the effort will go into seeing what bilateral deals you can do with the Americans, because there's lots, it's easier to do. Yeah. Does that seem fair?
It seems fair. I mean, we only share a last name, but we also share views on, Raja and I share views on this. And I think a lot of Indian analysts have written about it. Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, when asked about the border negotiations, also said, let's wait and watch. So as I said, it's a very contested region, and just these sort of two patrolling right negotiations won't solve it all, but it is a step in the right direction. I mean, it is good to see China come to the table.
We were talking last night, Dewi. In the spring, I was in Beijing for a few weeks at Tsinghua University, and at the same time, there was a visit to Beijing by President-elect Prabowo, unusually so, as in Beijing doesn't normally roll out the red carpet to someone, even when they've won the election but haven't been inaugurated. And so there was lots of speculation about what one should read into that. What is Prabowo's sort of instinct in terms of the US-China challenge that faces the whole of Asia? Which way does the wind blow on that?
Yeah, if you remember Prabowo's background, his military army from the New Order government that was very anti-communist. throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, until the end of the Cold War, Indonesia saw China as a primary threat. Indonesia established diplomatic relations with China in 1950, but we broke up that relations, froze the relations 1966 to about 1990. And Prabowo grew up in that situation, viewing China as a threat. And when he contested the presidency, 2014, 2019, he was very critical of Joko Widodo for opening up Indonesian economy to China, very open to Chinese investment and so on. So he was very anti-China. Then he joined the government, and then he is, in the promise of being the anointed heir of Joko Widodo, pledged to continue Jokowi's policy. So that meant that, he softened his stance on China. So I imagine that Xi Jinping rolling out the red carpet to Prabowo, even before he was formally announced as a winner in the election, was trying to gain the goodwill of Prabowo, that his natural instinct of being very critical of China would be toned down, and that he would really continue Jokowi's legacy of infrastructure development, being part of BRI and so on. In fact, if you're interested, James, I'd like to promote, I've just published an article in Asia Policy. It's called The Many Facets of Prabowo Subianto, Co-Fighters Indonesia's Foreign Policy. And I said, on security, he's very much a realist. He in fact invited John Mearsheimer to brief his pre-cabinet appointment just 3 days before his appointment. The world is, it's an anarchy, and you have to think about, the world from a realist perspective. But on economy now, he's very much a pragmatist. So dealing with China, continuing to be open to China is, of course, it's very important. And I think that's what Xi Jinping opening up the Great Hall meeting.
Can I come in here? That's really interesting to hear, because I think India had the opposite. So Modi, when he was the chief minister of his state, often talked about the China model of development. When he became the prime minister, he was very keen on working with China, the Wuhan summit, and then what was reciprocated in Delhi. And I think the idea of India joining BRICS also was in the spirit of perhaps finding more common ground with China and with Russia. And interestingly, BRICS 1 was in a unipolar moment. But as sort of China's push of sort of greater role in the Indo-Pacific increased, and push for unipolar Asia dominated by China, it led India to really rethink its positions. And now it plays a completely different role in BRICS Plus. So it's an interesting contrast of the two leaders and what their approach towards China was. And I mean, the Indian U-turn is pretty clear.
Let me ask both of you about, so there was a phrase that I think Nico used, quoting Evan Medeiros, that Asia is moving from or Asian nations are moving from becoming kind of price takers to price setters. And so baked into that is the notion that we are expecting Asian leaders to be diplomatic leaders in the international system. In a sense, that's what we're waiting for with the BRICS platform. At the moment, it hasn't done terribly much, but the idea is that once you set up this group of countries, then it will become a kind of a forum for initiatives, whether it's digital currencies or whatnot. When Prabowo came to the Shangri-La Dialogue 2 years ago, he rolled out a Ukraine peace plan, which he seemed to have thought up over breakfast, and certainly hadn't briefed his foreign ministry about, much to their kind of consternation. And the thing which involved creating a demilitarized zone down the middle of Ukraine didn't last the afternoon, but it did show an ambition on his behalf to, albeit in a slightly cack-handed way, sort of come up with big international ideas. Do you think that that's something that he will do? And I guess maybe the same question to you, both about Ukraine and in general about the sort of initiatives that we might expect these leaders to come up with in the international system.
Well, that's one of the exciting thing, but also the danger of a foreign policy precedent. Somebody, high-level diplomacy, where sometimes they come up with ideas not necessarily being discussed before with, with bureaucracy and so on, and people have to scramble. But, you're right that I was there, and I remember that the European audience was very hostile to Prabowo, and the Ukraine defense minister said in that afternoon session that Prabowo's proposal of having a demilitarized zone and then having a referendum in the territories occupied by Russia seems to be a peace proposal made up in Moscow. But the fact of the matter is that, Prabowo had this courage, the gumption, you might say, to offer this, and then this year he came back. Well, you're still there, right, in Singapore?
Nope, moved back. But...
So he was given a special forum as the president-elect, and he said, well, I stand by my proposal last year, because what happened in the past year, the situation is getting worse. And what is the end game here? So he continues. So yes, I think that he has an ambition. Whether that ambition is going to be accompanied by, really thoughtful and workable proposal, that's another matter. Whether it's going to be, we see him very much, people ask me who is Indonesia's foreign minister, and he says his name is Prabowo, because the current foreign minister is very much an aide of Prabowo.
Right.
Someone who's been with him from the very beginning, a member of his party, and I think he's been put in charge of foreign ministry to ensure that he's a conduit, what the president wants. There are 3 vice ministers, one who is in charge of the Muslim world, and 2 diplomats who are very seasoned diplomats. But at the end of the day, I think it is very much a president's foreign policy.
Maybe we could just focus on Russia-Ukraine, because without being parochial for a European audience, and this is a kind of prime concern, Modi went to Moscow on the day of the NATO summit, pissed off a lot of people in the West for doing that. Maybe they overread what was going on there. Maybe you could just sort of characterize the nature of the India-Russia relationship and the role, if any, that you would expect India to play in now a Trump era peace process over Ukraine.
Let me start by saying that Modi he did not choose to go to Moscow at the same time as the NATO summit. There's so little knowledge of NATO and generally the West in the ministry that they completely overlooked that these dates were clashing. And we've heard this now come a few times, but it is true. I mean, NATO has no bearing in the Indian imagination, and nobody really knows anything about NATO, which is why a lot of Indians bought into Russian disinformation campaign about the cause of the war in Ukraine. And you would see a lot of sort of educated Indians believing in that, because NATO outreach to India has been very minimal. Zooming out to the Indian relationship with Russia. So before the invasion, at the onset of the invasion, there were more Indian students studying in Ukraine than there were in Russia. India's trade, economic, security, diplomatic partnerships were with the West. There were no real pillars of the India-Russia relationship besides weapons and arms. And there too, for the last decade, India has been trying to diversify and do, for example, more with France and the US, looking for Western partners. So this was sort of a relationship in sort of autopilot mode with no real ambition. After the outbreak of the war and isolation of Russia from the West, I think the biggest concern for India is if Russia and China get closer together, and that is to the detriment of Indian foreign policy interests. Now, this has been from the beginning of the Indian Republic. The Russia, China, India triangle has been very interesting to watch. Russia, for example, added India to SCO to balance China's presence in the institution. In the 1962 war, when India and China went to war, Moscow sided openly with Beijing and tipping the scales firmly in China's favor. So for this is a very crucial relationship for India. And an isolated Moscow that is going to be a junior partner to Beijing is not in India's interests, which is why they keep engaging Russia, and they will keep doing so. But I often say India's participation in SCO or BRICS Plus does not come close to the investments the country has made in the Quad. So not all participations are equal, and often people end up comparing what is essentially apples and oranges, saying, why did Russia, India participate in ABC military exercise, which doesn't even come close to, for example, the US-India military exercises.
And it's worth noting for a European audience that the largest supplier of oil to Europe is now India. because the oil comes from Russia and then is refined in India and is sent back to Europe, which is a point that Indians make about European hypocrisy. So,
indeed, if you talk about circumventing sanctions, why are many European countries buying this oil then from India? Although I personally don't agree with this, but this is not about my personal.
James, there's Indonesia and India, we're both non-aligned. But when it comes to the war, India and Indonesia behave very differently in the UN. Indonesia supported the UN sanction, criticizing Russia, both on the invasion and then the forced incorporation of the Ukrainian territories. India abstained, while Indonesia supported that. But Indonesia did not support the sanctions because it imports a lot of fertilizers.
And also weapons, right? Like defense cooperation?
It's a good point to make, which is, I suppose I would ask both of you, as in India and Indonesia, pillars of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. I mean, Indonesia still seems to me sort of fundamentally to think of itself as non-aligned, and I don't really think India does anymore. Would that be fair, Garima?
Yeah, I mean, India uses the term multi-alignment, diversifying partnerships. As the foreign minister says, India works on its own interests, etc. I think it is very different from the era of non-alignment, which was a different time in world politics anyway, with decolonizing waves, etc. But I should just add on the point of Russia that after the visit to Moscow during the NATO summit, this is when India decided to then visit Poland, which has been extremely critical of India's role and relationship with Russia and Ukraine.
So we've got 8 minutes and 28 seconds to go in this rapid session. It's been quite a geopolitical focus so far. Let's talk about the economy for our Swiss business audience. India and Indonesia sit both right in the center of two, probably the biggest economic changes in supply chains that are going on in the world at the moment. One in Indonesia in the sort of green tech batteries, the nickel supply chain. India as the only real plausible alternative for a country that can rebuild a manufacturing ecosystem that is similar to the one that China has built over the last generation or two. I suppose, could you tell the audience, in a sense, how those respective areas of economic development are growing, and should we be optimistic about the ability of sort of both countries to use these economic developments to power themselves up the sort of the middle income ladder, as it were?
Well, that's the ambition. For Indonesia, it used to be just exporting raw materials and then low-skilled manufacturing exports. At the moment, that's not going to help Indonesia move up the economic ladder. So the focus is very much how to increase the value added from Indonesia's natural commodities, from primary commodities. So instead of just exporting palm oils, we need to redevelop it within Indonesia. Instead of exporting nickels or cobalt, whatever, we need to have some value added activities within the country. This is considered to be very, very important, not just for job creations, but also to ensure that we are up in the economic ladders. And at the moment, China is the biggest player here. China is investing in nickel smelters, and then that has really been the focus of a lot of attention. Indonesia's ambition to be the biggest EV battery factories. But I think Indonesia wants to diversify its economies. So James, when you said, Indonesia still sees itself as being non-aligned, but this is non-alignment 2.0. The previous non-alignment is really trying to be aloof, leave us alone. We do not want to be too close to anyone. Today's non-alignment is multi-engagement. Indonesia, I said, policymakers never call themselves hedging. But in fact, I've written about Indonesia's hedging plus policy in the face of China's rise and US-China rivalry. Indonesia's developed very close relations with China economically. On security, is very close to the United States. But now that with these issues of decoupling, it is going to be a real dilemma for Indonesia. If it becomes too dependent, for example, on investment on China, how would it affect Indonesia's access to European market or American market? So I think that they're going to look very closely, to what extent we could allow foreign domination in any sectors, because we do not want to be excluded from any market.
Exactly, that's exactly the same. What India thinks is the whole idea of Make in India and self-independent India, Atmanirbhar, is because they do not want to replicate, how dependent India is, for example, on Russia, for example, on defense. India never wants to replicate it again. So it's definitely a part. James, I talked about manufacturing in the morning, so I won't repeat those points. India definitely wants to play a part in tech supply chains and do more there, electronics, semiconductors, etc. I think the problem for India, I was quite optimistic in the first session. Let me also do a reality check in this one. I think the issue for India is inherently a protectionist country now has to turn and open its markets to the world. And that comes with its own challenges. And even though the current ruling party is trying very hard to go down on that path, a lot of their sort of domestic support is critical of free trade agreements and opening the economy too much. So I think that will be the crucial challenge for India, the speed, the delivery, really capitalizing on India's moment right now, and not letting it pass.
I mean, maybe we want to end with a note of optimism. So let me ask, in a sense, both of you a general question about, tell us something about India and Indonesia that we might not know to be optimistic about. It could be a particular sector that is booming, or a policy initiative that might capture people's imagination. It could be a new capital city which is coming up and I'm sure sprouting in Borneo. Maybe, Garima, in a sense, if you were a Swiss investor or a Swiss geopolitical analyst looking at India and you see all of these problems in the world, what would be a reason? In a sense, the title of our session is "Can they pull it off?" So give us a reason for optimism to say that India can.
I mean, for me in the economic space, what is really exciting is something that sounds boring and bureaucratic, but PLI, Production-Led Incentive Scheme. I think that's really...
Explain what that is for those who don't know,
so
including me.
The government fast-tracks companies that want to invest and create manufacturing centers in India in certain sectors that are considered important, including tech. And then you put the whole might of the Indian government behind you and breeze through all the bureaucratic hassles and all the permits and everything. And I think if we could just expand it to all sectors and the general approach, that would be interesting. But for me, I think this is quite interesting. The semiconductor conversation is really interesting.
There we go. Well, I'll give one for me on India, which is that when I moved back from Asia to London in the summer, I had to go and buy myself a new phone, and this iPhone is made in India. So there we are. So, what optimism for Indonesia?
Well, for Indonesia, when we had been listening to the fear that South Korea would be disappearing, because of aging and so on. Well, Indonesia, like India, still enjoys demographic dividend. So there's a huge pool of young talent there, and they're consuming. They are going to be productive for at least 20 to 30 years more. So that this is the golden age, and that this creates a lot of optimism, but also there's concerns about whether they're going to be well-educated enough, well-trained enough, whether there'll be jobs. But at the same time, this is considered to be a major boom. And then Indonesia is one of the countries that is blessed by nature. Indonesia is so well endowed with natural resources. At the moment, the natural resources are not going to be exported in raw form anymore, and they're going to be, at least semi-developed within the countries, and so that is considered to be a real opportunities. And thirdly, of course, location. Southeast Asia and then Indonesia is right in the middle of the heart of the Indo-Pacific, not just geographically. The sea lanes of communications, the three most important sea lanes of communication have to come through Indonesia. So for Indonesia, when we're talking about the US-China rivalry, for us, international law is very, very important. So when you're talking about revolution, radical, and so on, yes, but the changes for us is actually for countries to pay more attention to international law.
Correct.
For us, for Indonesia as an archipelagic state, Indonesia played a leading role in the development of UNCLOS 1982. The existence of our territories, was really, really dependent on recognition of that. Yeah. So now, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, we haven't talked very much. It's a country that wants to change the world in a way for the world to pay more attention to international law. And this means that whether it's the United States, whether it's Russia or China, they're all violating international laws. They cannot really be relied on to be the gatekeepers of multilateralism and internationals, and Indonesia and Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN. You know, we are at the far front of trying to continue to support that. And I think that this is optimism that, you know, agency. Yesterday, there was Adam talked about strategic autonomy and agency, and I think that the ASEAN countries and Indonesia being the largest member of ASEAN, we want to ensure our agency that we do matter, and actually, you know, what we matter most is actually for the keeping the international system based on rule-based order.
Okay, all right. Well, so if you're a Swiss investor with a few Swiss francs in your pocket, you have a qualified endorsement to go and invest in India and Indonesia. Can they pull it off? Probably yes. Nico, over to you. Thank you very much, my panelists.